Why do adults behave like children? There have been, it seems, an increasing number of events on airplanes recently where adults are behaving like children. In August, so last month, Plane Lady. Anyone see Plane Lady? That guy is not real. Plane Lady went on a rant. A plane was about to depart from Texas and fly to Florida. The engines were running. They're about to taxi toward takeoff, and all of a sudden, this woman gets up. She starts walking up and down the aisle, screaming profanities, being combative with people, making threats, and demanding to get off the plane. They had to halt the plane, taxi back to the gate, deplane to get this woman off. People are like, was she under the influence of something? Like, what's happening? But of course, this is happening like over and over again, right? In April, this past April, there was a Southwest flight from Baltimore going to Florida. I'll leave it up to you whether you should draw any conclusions. The flight was in a holding pattern flying over Florida. It was about to land, and a baby started to cry. After a couple minutes, an agitated adult man screamed out, "Shut that baby up!" and started to scream, yelling profanities about the baby, threatening to escalate the situation. At one point, a staff member came up and started talking to the man, and the man said, "Sir, please stop your yelling." And he replied, "So is the baby." Yeah, touche. Why do people not understand that it's not okay to behave in ways that inconvenience or even endanger other people? Why do people need to be told that there's a difference between a child screaming and an adult screaming? Why do people need to be walked through that? Why do adults behave like children? You may have many ideas in your mind about this, many answers about why adults behave like children. Maybe we think we haven't really grown up, maybe because we want things really badly. But regardless of the ideas that we have, there's sort of a question underneath this. Aside from the question of why do adults behave like children, there's a deeper question: why does it matter that adults sometimes behave like children? Because, of course, the initial reaction that we have to this, right, the idea that adults shouldn't behave like children, that we should grow up, is running against another cultural current that sort of says, well, sure, you can do whatever you want at any time. In fact, your life is about doing whatever you want. Your life is about getting whatever you want. Your life is about feeling whatever you want to feel and expressing it however you want to. And so these two currents are actually running in opposite directions. In one way, our culture says, sure, you can basically be a child or act like a child for as long as you want. It doesn't matter. Your life is about you. And yet instinctively, we look at immature behavior in adults and we go, act your age. Like, come on, grow up. Those two things are actually running in the exact opposite directions. Why does it matter in the first place that adults should not act like children? What are the costs when adults behave like little kids? What are the costs in our lives? What are the costs in our families? What are the costs societally when adults decide not to grow up? These are some of the questions that we're going to be asking today. I've titled today's sermon, I Don't Want to Do the Right Thing. And we are walking through a sermon series where we're just walking verse by verse through the text of Jonah. And we're looking at the idea of spiritually growing up, spiritual maturity. And last week we listened to a sermon titled, I Don't Want to Grow Up. And we looked at how one of the first movements in immaturity in our lives is we run away. We run away from something that we don't want to endure, that we don't want to have to experience, a challenge that we don't want to face, something in our life that we didn't want it to go that way. And so we run away. And this week we're going to look at the second essential movement in immaturity, how running away from challenging things in our lives leads us to behave badly, leads us to bad behavior and to being unable to do the right thing. We're going to be in Jonah chapter 1, verses 4 to 6. So if you have a Bible or a device of some sort, I encourage you to open that up. We've got Bibles in the back here. Clint is grabbing one right now. You can grab one. You can take one if you don't have a Bible. Jonah is an Old Testament prophets. So, it depends how if you flip to Isaiah, keep flipping. Jeremiah, Ezekiel, then the names start to change really fast. Go slow. Jonah. Or hit Matthew and flip back the other way and go slow. You get either way, Isaiah or Matthew, the helpful bookends to figure out where Jonah is. Again, we're in Jonah chapter 1, verses 4 through 6. I'll read the text aloud. But the Lord hurled a great wind upon the sea, and there was a mighty tempest on the sea, so that the ship threatened to break up. Then the mariners were afraid, and each cried out to his God, and they hurled the cargo that was in the ship into the sea to lighten it from them. But Jonah had gone down into the inner part of the ship and had laid down and was fast asleep. So the captain came and said to him, "What do you mean, you sleeper? Arise, call out to your God. Perhaps the God will give a thought to us, that we may not perish." The world needs people who will do the right thing. The world needs people who will do the right thing. And we see in Jonah chapter 1 that this ship is crewed by sailors who are able to do the right thing. They're people who are able to do the right thing. And we see three things that these sailors do in this situation that reflect the fact that they're people who are doing the right thing and who are able to do the right thing. Three things that they do that combine to them doing the right thing. The first thing that they do is they recognize the reality of the situation that they're in. They're in a storm, a bad storm, a storm that is threatening to break apart the ship and sink the boat. And the sailors, in response to that, are what? In verse 5, they're afraid. Now, you may look at that at first and go, well, of course, we would all be afraid. But the human capacity for self-deception is astounding. It's just shocking. It's truly remarkable and incredible. And the first step towards being able to do the right thing is to feel in ourselves and have a response in our hearts and in our spirits that corresponds to the reality of the situation that you're in. So often, people are unable to do the right thing because they will not live in the reality of a situation, right? And we see this just in sort of everyday kind of ways, right? Like someone who's at a funeral and they're cracking jokes. Okay, you are not understanding what's happening here. You are not bringing a corresponding internal posture to the reality of the situation. Or someone who's at a wedding and they're scrolling on their phone. You are not responding to the reality of the situation here. And of course, those are smaller, maybe socially annoying ways that people don't do that. But of course, as things rise in our lives in terms of the stakes of the situations that we're in, an inability to live in the reality of the situation becomes increasingly costly. The sailors are afraid because they're in a terrible storm, and they know what the cost of that storm will be. And because they're afraid, because they're responding rightly to the reality of their situation, it leads them to be able to do the second thing that leads them to do the right thing. And that is, they take costly action to address the situation at hand. Because they're living in reality, they then are able to act with conviction and take costly action to address the situation. And so they throw the cargo of the ship overboard, right? Again, in verse 5, they hurled the cargo that was in the ship into the sea to lighten it for them. You may read that at first and think, well, of course they would, anything to make the ship lighter. But of course, these sailors, their whole job, their whole life is ferrying people and cargo from one place to another to make money. So once they decide to throw the cargo of the ship overboard, they're deciding to make no money on this job. Right? I mean, what would it be for you to say, I'm going to decide to not take 2 paychecks in a row? What would that do to your life? What would that do to your ability to pay your rent? What would that do to your mental space? To your these sailors have made a costly decision to say, I am not going to get any, I might not be able to feed my family. But none of those things matter in this moment because we need to act with conviction to do what is right in this situation. They live in reality, they take costly action to address the situation, and then they give up control. The sailors here are wonderful models of people who in a costly situation say, God is ultimately over the situation. Right? In verse 5 it says, each of the sailors cried out to his God. Now these ancient Near Eastern, probably Phoenician sailors are polytheists. They all have local deities that they're worshiping, and certainly the Old Testament generally would have things to say about worshiping a God other than the God of Israel. But in this moment, The sailors here are being portrayed as faithful people who, in a moment of their need, give up control over the situation and cry out to God the best they know how. These are three elements of what it takes to do the right thing in a situation. Recognize the reality of the situation, take costly action to address it, and then give up control and cry out to God. The sailors are people, as a result, who not just do the right thing, but they're able to do the right thing. They move through these three phases with a fashion that reflects the facts that they're honest and able to do this. And the really interesting thing is that people who do this, people who do the right thing, who move through these three movements in their lives, often, maybe not all the time, but often, find themselves accidentally stumbling into what God is doing in the situation. In verse 4, if we were to ask God, God, what are you doing in this situation? God would say, I'm throwing things. Because in verse 4, God hurls a great wind upon the sea. And did you notice in verse 5 that the sailors correspondingly hurl the cargo into the sea? Because when we stand up in a situation, instead of running away from it or behaving badly, when we stand up and say, this is what I feel called to do in this situation, so I'm going to do it, very frequently we find ourselves doing the same thing that God is doing in that situation. When we stand up and tell the truth about something, so often it happens that God is revealing the truth in that situation. When we abstain from sin, so often God is separating himself from sin. When we show costly kindness in a situation, so often God is in the business of showing mercy. And so when we stand up and do the right thing, we often stumble into what God is doing in the situation anyways. And our world needs people who will, or maybe even just can, that they're able to do the right thing. Our world is full of problems, individual problems, familial problems, societal problems, ecological problems, and our world thinks that we can just sort of create a solution and then kind of just do it and fix the problem. And so our world is full of plans to fix all these huge, chronic problems. But the problem with that is that these plans are, even at their best, just our best description of how we think the problem is going to get solved. All plans need people to carry them out. All plans need people who can do the right thing in order to carry them out and solve that situation. And so our world needs people who not just have ideas about how something will get solved, but those ideas are being carried out by people who are able to do the right thing. This is true in our world. It's true in our own lives. You know, we feel it when people in our own lives cannot be relied upon to do the right thing. Right? We feel that in our lives. When we've got someone close to us, and there are many different spheres of our lives, anyone in any of these spheres who cannot be relied upon to do the right thing. When there's an adult in our lives who won't act their age. When there are stewards in our lives who aren't responsible with their resources. When there are loves in our lives that can't be relied on to be faithful or kind. And whenever someone like this is close to us in our lives, we feel it. We feel the cost and impact in our life of going, this person can't be relied upon to do the right thing. How much more then when we can't be relied upon to do the right thing? As much as we like to think that all of our problems are out there, no one's actions impact your life more than yours do. Your actions are the primary things that operate on your life. Yes, external actions matter. Yes, we're born into different situations with different contingencies, things we didn't choose that make life more challenging or more difficult. But just through, if we were to count them, counting the actions, your actions are the ones that impact on your life the most, not actions externally and other people. So when you can't be relied on to do the right thing, your life is going to suffer. When we can't be relied on to abstain from harm, when we can't be relied on to make wise choices over time, we'll have delayed gratification and been able to reap a harvest of wisdom over time. When we can't be relied upon to put ourselves and our ears and our eyes and our minds near influences that are good for us, those choices, when we can't be relied on to do the right thing, really impact our lives. And the reality is that our world and our lives are just crying out for people who can be relied on to do the right thing, especially when the situation is costly. And all the solutions to all our problems in our world, in our society, and in our lives are useless unless those solutions are taken up by people who can do what is right, especially when it's costly. People who are mature enough and grown up enough to do the right thing. Our world needs people who can do the right thing, but the reality is that our world and our lives are full of people who are not able to do what is right, who are not able to do the right thing. This world is full of people who cannot do the right thing. And in a very surprising and paradoxical way, our example in this text of the person who cannot do the right thing is the prophet of God, Jonah, the person whose job it is to listen to God and to seek to do the right thing. Jonah, in this passage, is behaving very badly. And he's doing the opposite of the three things that the sailors are doing. Living in reality, taking action that's full of conviction. And what was the third thing? Hey, there it is. Rely on God. Give up control, rely on God. Jonah's not able to participate in any of those things. He's not living in reality. You know, it's not a time to be hiding in the hull of a ship. When a ship is under siege by a great storm, it doesn't matter where you go in the ship. If the storm is going to break apart the ship, you can't hide from the storm anywhere on the ship, right? And Jonah is sleeping, right? The mariners are afraid. Jonah has gone to sleep. The Hebrew says, and Jonah lied down and went to sleep. The Greek says that Jonah went to sleep and was snoring. So the Greek even gives us a little bit of a picture where like Jonah's really out. He's like really just sawing logs down there, while everyone else is afraid and responding rightly to the reality of the situation. Jonah's not able to do that. Jonah, as a result, doesn't act with conviction while the rest of the sailors are running around trying to do things that will save everybody's life. Jonah's not able to act in a way that corresponds to the reality of the situation. And Jonah's not able to give up to control and cry out to God, even though it's his job as a prophet to do that. Now, it's very easy for us to look at this and just focus on the moralistic level and say, well, Jonah's behaving badly, that's because he's bad. Or maybe we look at this and say, well, we're evil, or I've had some bad verdict pronounced over me, and that's why I'm doing things that are bad. But Jonah here is actually behaving badly because of what he did in verses 1 through 3, because he's running away. Jonah's bad behavior in this situation is an overflow of the fact that he's running away. I don't know if you noticed in last week's text, in Jonah chapter 1, verse 3, when Jonah rose to flee to Tarshish from the presence of the Lord, and then the text says he went down to Joppa. He went down. That imagery of Jonah's downward trajectory happens 2 more times in this passage. Jonah has descended down to Joppa, and then in verse 5 it says Jonah went down into the inner part of the ship, and then Jonah laid down and went to sleep. Jonah's running away is reflected in the imagery of his downward descent, which began in last week's text and is continuing in this week's text. And if you know where the text is going, Jonah has a couple more layers of down to go before he's hit rock bottom. And this downward trajectory of Jonah is the revelation of his running away from Nineveh. We all have Ninevehs in our lives. Things that we didn't want to be true about our lives, but they are. A place that we've arrived in, or a place that we've been called to, that we didn't really want to go to, but here we are. I didn't want to be single at this point in my life. I wanted a better career where I felt like I had more success. I wanted a bigger apartment or more material things, whatever these things are. And instead of standing up and growing up and facing those things, so often we run away. We say, I don't want that Nineveh to be true over my life. I don't want to dwell in that place, so I'm going to run instead to Tarshish. Oh, Tarshish. The place where I get whatever I want. Where the sun is always shining and the sand, white sand beaches, just incredible. And we just spend our lives fleeing to Tarshish over and over again. But what's really happening when we're fleeing is instead of growing up, we're descending on our way to Tarshish. We're not literally growing upward. We're growing down, back into the ground, which, of course, is where people go when they're dead. We become spiritually dead. We grow down into the ground, and we descend and descend and descend. And this is what Jonah is doing. He's running away to Tarshish, and so he's behaving badly. And we are chronically running away in our lives. And so we're chronically behaving badly. Sometimes we behave badly because we're evil. But oftentimes we're behaving badly because we're immature. We're running away from something, and so we behave badly. Maturity is able to behave well even when it doesn't get what it wants. Maturity is able to do that. And we have a physical parable of this spiritual reality in the everyday process of human development and human physical growth. Toddlers don't get what they want, and they behave badly in response. They just do. They're overwhelmed by their needs and their wants and their desires, and so when they don't get what they want, they often behave badly. But ideally, not all the time, but ideally, as we grow physically, we begin to not get what we want, and yet we still behave well, mostly, in those situations. It's just an everyday part of what it is to grow physically as a person. We gain more control and mature control over our impulses and our feelings and our desires. But this is just a parable of what's really happening in terms of spiritual growth, because we have deeper spiritual longings. Longings for family, longings for relationships, longing for intimacy, physical intimacy, longing for satisfying work and expression of my vocation. And yet, so many of us have not grown up spiritually in respect to those things. We've grown up physically enough such that we can, control our immediate emotions when we're annoyed until we get on a plane and a baby starts crying, then we freak out. What is it about freaking out and behaving badly on vessels of transportation? Planes, ships. We're all going somewhere, and we're all behaving badly on the way. Many of us have not grown up spiritually with respect to these deeper longings that we have. Maturity would say, I'm going to give up control over whether or not I get this thing, but I want to behave well anyways, because that's what a spiritually grown-up person would do. But immaturity says, if I don't get these things, I'm going to behave badly. And we see people like this all the time. We are these people. The friend who so desperately wants an intimate relationship, and their lust after this makes them a terrible and flaky friend to you. Because as soon as some new object of their desire comes into their life, they're gone. Were you even friends at all? I don't know. I can't get a hold of them. They won't respond to me. The person who isn't having the sex that they want to have, and so they use that to justify their pornography use. If I can't get this thing, I'm going to run away to this place. The individual who doesn't have the material things they wanted, and so they have incredibly unwise and unhealthy habits with their money. And in all of these examples, there's always a cost to this bad behavior that is so frequently paid by other people. Sometimes it's paid by us. Ultimately, it's paid by us. But so often in the immediate term, it's paid by other people. And all these patterns are incredibly destructive to ourselves and to others. And we need to get out of our bad behavior and do the right thing. How do we get out of our bad behavior? How do we get out of our bad behavior when we are in the thick of it? Well, one way, one mechanism, if we'll receive it, if we'll listen to it, is that we receive some conviction about our behavior. We let ourselves get called out by God or somebody else. And Jonah experiences this in this passage. Jonah gets called out on his bad behavior. The ship captain comes down in verse 6. Verse 6 says, so the captain came and said to him, what do you mean, you sleeper? This is a really terse phrase in Hebrew that people translate it in all sorts of wonderful ways to try to get the meaning across. It's sort of like, sleeping? You've got to be joking me. Or what the hell? I mean, it's like this very upset, terse, what are you doing? How could you be laying down sleeping when everyone else is up on the ship responding rightly to the situation and fighting for their lives? The ship captain calls Jonah out for his bad behavior, and then the ship captain tells Jonah the same thing that God told him in last week's verses. God told Jonah to rise and go to Nineveh, and what does the ship captain tell Jonah to do? Arise. He tells him to get up. He calls out his bad behavior, and then he tells him the same thing God told him to do that he run away from. He says, stand up. Get up, Jonah. Stop this. Stop this running away. Stop this descending. Stand up and call out to your God. Which, of course, it's Jonah's job to do that. He's a prophet. He's the only one not doing this on the ship, and it's his job. Jonah now has every opportunity to behave rightly. But he still has to respond well. And we have to respond well in our lives when we're called out in our bad behavior. There's no sign here that Jonah responds in any mature way to being called out. And this really is the problem with this as a mechanism. Just the idea that we're going to change our bad behavior by getting called out or convicted on it. The problem is that we can run away from that too. There's no sign that Jonah has responded, but in our lives, we hate getting called out for our bad behavior. And oftentimes, our first reactions are to ignore. I mean, if someone ever, and it takes a lot of courage to show up to somebody and say, hey, I've got some questions about this behavior in your life. And so often, we don't reward people for that courage. Sometimes people do that, and they're just kind of being jerks. Right? They're moralistic, or they've got this I'm a truth teller complex, or whatever. But sometimes we get the grace in our lives of being called out by somebody in our lives who says, listen, I love you and I'm seeing this thing. It may not be hurting you now. You might not be able to see the effects yet, but it will. The consequences are coming. And I just want to be one voice that's saying you should question that. So often we have responses that try to get those voices away from us. We ignore them. We minimize them. We blame other people. And so we find ways to run away from that too, even when loving people have the grace to confront us. And so it looks like we can keep engaging in our bad behavior, just keep running away for forever. But the thing is that the God of the Bible just won't let you do that. He won't. The God of the Bible loves you too much. He loves other people too much to keep allowing us to put them on our vessel and then behave badly with them along the way. God loves people enough to curtail and bring an end to our bad behavior. And he hopes that we'll receive correction along the way. The God of the Bible is the God who chases us down when we run away and start behaving badly. And God is chasing Jonah down here in Jonah chapter 1, verse 4. The Lord hurled a great wind upon the sea, so there was a mighty tempest on the sea, so that the ship threatened to break up. The language of hurled suggests that God is actively pursuing Jonah. And of course, what is God's strategy here? I'll break the ship up. In order to stop your bad behavior, I will destroy this ship. And the reality is that so often when we're not willing to come under conviction for ways that we're behaving badly, that is the only strategy available to God. I will destroy this vessel that you're on. I will not allow you to keep traveling to the place that you're going. I won't allow you to harm other people along the way if they happen to be on the vessel with you. So often, this is the only opportunity, and this is what many of us, how we choose to live our lives. We have things that we're doing that are destructive to ourselves and to others. They don't fit the situation that we're actually in. It's bad behavior. We're not able to do the right thing. And instead of receiving conviction, we say, I'm going to do this until the consequences become so high that it stops me in what I'm doing. And of course, that's an option. And that is an option for you. And if the conviction of the Lord is coming to you right now and he's raising up something in your own life that is bad behavior, that needs to be addressed, it needs to be found out, it needs to be caught, you are in a place where you are going to choose. Am I going to allow God to show that to me and begin to deal with it? Or am I just going to hide it and keep doing it until it wreaks these terrible consequences in my life, until the ship breaks up? And so many people choose to live that way. They choose to say, you know what, I'm going to keep doing this until the vessel bursts into pieces, and that will stop me. And so many people do that. And the real bummer about that is that with the God of the Bible, you actually don't have to wait until that happens. Because when you find yourself on that ship in your own life, and all of a sudden you look around and go, wow, I'm not acting right. I'm not living right in this area of my life. You don't have to wait until the vessel breaks into pieces. You can call out to God right there. And the funny thing is that God is there already with you. He's there. He's in the ship already. He got in the ship with you, saying, I'll be with you while you make all these terrible decisions, and I'll journey with you. And if you would call out to him, he would be there and hear you, because the funny thing is he's there. He's actually asleep in the ship too. God's also asleep in the ship of the storms of your bad decisions. And yet he's not asleep like Jonah is, because Jonah is sleeping in the ship to run away. Jesus is asleep in the ship of all of your bad choices, because he trusts God so much that he's at peace in that place with you, even while the storm's raging around you. It's such a puzzle mapping Jonah's sleeping on the ship onto Jesus' sleeping on the ship in the storm in the Gospels. They both look like they're doing the same thing, but it couldn't be more different. This is what Luke chapter 8, verses 22 to 25 says. One day, Jesus got into a boat with his disciples, and he said to them, let's go across to the other side of the lake. So they set out. And as they sailed, he fell asleep. And a windstorm came down in the lake, and they were filling with water and were in danger. And they went and woke him, saying, Master, Master, we are perishing. And he awoke and rebuked the wind and the raging waves. And they ceased, and there was a calm. And he said to them, where's your faith? Jonah's asleep in the bottom of a boat because he's running away. And so storms come upon him because he's fleeing God and fleeing things in his life that he doesn't want to face. But Jesus is able to do what looks like the exact same thing and have it mean something totally different, because he actually is sleeping in the middle of a storm because he believes in God's ability to calm any storm once we call out to him. And this is true in our own lives. And it's what's on offer for us in our own lives when we are caught in the storms of our own making, of our own inability to do the right thing. God is with us and is able to help us when we recognize that we are not able to do the right thing. We really have two choices when it becomes clear to us that we're not able to do the right thing. We can keep doing it until God's sovereignty and life shatter the ship into pieces. That's one choice. Don't let that happen to you and then pretend you didn't choose it. I mean, if that's the course that you're on, just know that you chose it, because then at least you're honest. At least you're spiritually awake in the honesty of who you are and what you're doing. Don't lie to yourself and say, well, I don't know, this just happened to me. When the ship burst into pieces, we made many choices along the way that helped it get there. That's one option for you. It's one option for us in our life. The second option is that we can call out to God and he'll help us do the right thing. We actually recognize that he's been just peacefully with us in the whole thing the whole time, because he knows that when you call out to God, God will help you. When we believe, like Jesus asked them, where is your faith? When we believe that God can calm the storms of our bad behavior, God is then able to use these things to grow us. And he uses them to do all three of the things that he was doing in the lives of the sailors. God helps us to first live in the reality of the situation. Because when we believe that God is with us in something that we're caught in, when we believe that God is with us, exposing us in our bad behavior, we actually gain power to face the reality of what's going on. We begin to be able to name, this is what's actually happening in my life, and this is my role in it. We begin to live in reality like the sailors were able to. We begin to be able to say, this is what's going on, and this is how I contributed to it. We stop putting it on external things or putting it on other people. We start to say, this is what's going on in my life, and this is where I am in it. And then that is power to become able to take costly, decisive action in this thing in my life. What will it take for me to actually begin to do the right thing in this situation in a way that corresponds to its reality? And then finally, like the sailors, we give up control over the external outcomes. The ship captain has a wonderful line here in verse 6. After he tells Jonah to arise and call out to your God, he says, perhaps the God will give a thought to us that we may not perish. And all of that sailor's faith and letting go of control isn't captured in that phrase. Literally, it's just, who knows? Who knows what God will do in our lives, especially in the places where things aren't right, where I'm behaving badly, when I'm able to name what's actually happening and take action to address it and then give it up to God. Who knows what God will be able to do? That phrase, who knows, is full of all of the faith of expecting that God really does love me. God really does see me. God really is gracious towards me. God already knew that I would fall and stumble in this way. God knows my struggles with immaturity. God knows all these things. But who knows? The God of the Bible is good and merciful and gracious, and he can grow me up and save me in this thing. All of that faith and trust and hope and expectation in God's actions in our lives is encapsulated in that phrase. Who knows? And we come to that same place in our own lives when we say, this is what's actually happening in my life. This is who I actually am right now. This is the costly action that God's leading me to take to address it. And then who knows, maybe the God of the Bible really is good and loving and gracious, and he'll change me and grow me up through it. Who knows? Maybe God will give a thought to you. We need to be able to be people who can do the right thing. And our world has so many problems and challenges and things where it actually doesn't need smart people to dream up new solutions. What it needs are everyday people who just stand up and do the right thing because it's in them. God's formed that in them. And yet we are not able to do that when we're running away and when we're just chronically running away from something in our lives. God is merciful and gracious to stop us in our running. If we would let him, he'll stop us now while the ship is intact in the storm, instead of when it's burst into a million splinters and we're just floating around the water hoping someone's going to lend us a hand. If we would let him, if we would call out to him and tell him the truth about what's going on in our lives, God would come and he would calm that storm and he would begin to help you get back to shore. God would do that because Jesus is loving and merciful and he wants to grow you and he can use every element of your life to grow you up. Amen.